Dear members of Humboldt University, dear President of the American Academy, and especially dear Professor Koh, we're extremely glad to have this evening together Humboldt University, the Law and Society Institute of the Law Faculty, and the American Academy host together this very special evening. Humboldt Law Faculty's Law and Society Institute stands for empirical legal research, empirical in a broad sense, also encompassing history, of course also the context of difficult times. And we are very glad that Professor Koh came today. And it was difficult in these times to come here, and that he came and is here and talks to us today about the difficult situation in the States. That's really very important to us. I will now hand over to the President, and a warm welcome, again, from the Law and Society Institute. Thank you so much.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to tonight's Lloyd Cutler lecture entitled How the National Security Constitution Evolved and What to Do About It, which will be delivered shortly by Professor Harold Koh, who is this semester's Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitor. And let me begin by just thanking the Humboldt Law and Society group, the Law and Society of the Humboldt Universität zu Berlin for hosting us in the Senatssaal tonight. So let me first say a word about the man for whom this lecture is named. The Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitorship was initiated in 2008, and it honors the legacy of one of the American Academy in Berlin's founding trustees, Lloyd Cutler. He was a prominent D.C. attorney, Washington, D.C. attorney, who co-founded Wilmer Cutler & Pickering, today known as Wilmer Hale, and he served as White House counsel to Presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. He served in other capacities in public life, beginning during World War II and throughout the rest of his days in administrations, both Democratic and Republican, something worth remembering. He was a diminutive man who cast an enormous shadow, and he had really extraordinary influence. And when Lloyd Cutler passed away in 2005, The Atlantic called him, quote, the last super lawyer. And in this spirit, the Lloyd Cutler Distinguished Visitorship at the American Academy brings only super U.S. legal scholars and practitioners of the very highest renown to Berlin for an in-depth exchange with German colleagues, counterparts, and the public. And I want to make a special note of thanking Wilmer Hale here in Berlin for being a great partner in doing this every year, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. Former Lloyd Cutler distinguished visitors include Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, Linda Greenhouse, perhaps the foremost chronicler of the Supreme Court in our time, and Appeals Court Judge David Tatel, who gave a dazzling presentation last spring. And there have been many, many others over the years. I think it is fair to say that one of the most surprising and indeed shocking aspects of the first 100 days of the second Trump administration has been its unprecedented use of executive power, with both explicit and implicit claims to authorities unlike any made by any other administration in American history. As we experience this in real time, it is natural enough to focus on the president who is wielding that power and the lawyers and others in his administration that are carrying out the specific actions. But this has not happened ex nihilo. There was a road that led to this moment, even if Trump's dominance of the media might make you forget that there was a time before. Indeed, there is a strong case to be made that even if Trump seems to have aggrandized executive power like no one before him. The ground was prepared for this by the practices of presidential administrations in the past. And it's hard to imagine anyone better than Harold Koh to trace the arc of that evolution and the shift from a, quote, shared powers model between the branches of government to what Harold described as executive unilateralism. And that is so because very few individuals have had the scholarly and the practical experience that Harold Koh possesses, and combining an unparalleled expertise in international law and U.S. constitutional practice, as well as time spent in the government. During the Obama administration, Harold served as legal advisor at the Department of State. He often used to say, and I remember him fondly saying, he was running the best law firm in the world. I hope Wilmer Hale doesn't take any offense at that. One of the best aspects of my job as coordinator for counterterrorism at that time was that I got to work frequently with Harold, and I learned a tremendous amount from him. He also reprised that job at the beginning of the Biden administration. He also served earlier during the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, a bureau that is slated for some kind of reinvention. If we're lucky, that's what will happen, as the administration and Secretary Rubio have declared that there will be a new Democracy, Human Rights, and Religious Rights, I believe, bureau. Harold also served in the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, which is really the nerve center of legal activity in any administration. He did that during the Reagan administration. Harold has taught at Yale Law since 1985. From 2004 to 2009, he was the dean of the law school, and he currently serves as Sterling Professor of International Law. He is the author of several books. His newest, The National Security Constitution in the 21st Century, is one of the central sources for this talk, and it revisits some of the issues that he first dealt with in the National Security Constitution, sharing power after the Iran-Contra affair, which came out in 1990. He's also written Transnational Litigation in United States Courts and the Trump Administration and International Law, which came out in 2018. Probably need a new version of that too, Harold. During a lifetime of advocacy for human rights, Harold Koh has received more honors than can possibly be mentioned. A graduate of Harvard College, Yale Law School, and Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. Harold has been involved with the Academy for many years, including, and he has a good story to tell about this, but I'm going to let him do that himself, our first Holbrook Forum, which he sort of got dragooned into running. And he is also, I'm proud to note, a trustee of the Academy now. It's also important to underscore that since 2016, Harold has represented Ukraine before the international courts, including the International Court of Justice. So just to give you a little roadmap, Harold will talk for about a half hour or so. Afterward, he and I will have an onstage discussion, and then we will invite the audience to pose questions as well. We just ask that if you are asking a question, make sure it has a question mark at the end. And now, without any further ado, Harold Koh, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back. I should note, by the way, I was remiss not to, this is actually Harold's second Lloyd Cutler lecture he gave at last in 2013. We figured that things had changed enough that it was okay to invite him back.
Thank you, President Benjamin. Thank you, Professor Kaisar. Thanks to the Humboldt Institute and also to the American Academy for inviting me back for this lecture. I want to thank some of my friends who have made a special trip, Professor Dr. Klaus Kress of the University of Cologne, and then very special friends, Professor Dr. Justice Suzanne Baer and Professor Justice Dr. Deity, Dieter Grimm. It's a joy to see you all. It's a simple question. When you learn about American politics in secondary school, you learn that the US Constitution has checks and balances. And the first 100 days of Trump have forced us to ask, are those guardrails really holding? How did the structural features of the US system become so distorted as to allow such an unprecedented display of executive power as we've seen in the last 100 days? And as Dan mentioned, my recent book captures 5 decades in which I've tried to study the confluence of institutional incentives that brought us to this precarious place. The book really tells 3 stories, which I will tell you. A personal story, how the book came to be written, a historical story, which is how our country got here, and an ethical story, which is how lawyers helped to create the problem and what they must now do to help fix it. So personally speaking, I should tell you that I was actually born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and for the first 8 years of my life, I lived on Humboldtstrasse, the meaning of which I did not fully appreciate until more recently. As Dan mentioned, I've worn 3 hats as a professor at Yale for now 40 years, in the US government, over 5 decades working for 2 judges and 4 presidents of both parties, and as Ukraine's legal counsel. And in the early days of my time as a professor, I taught a course on the Constitution and foreign affairs. And my argument was that within the US Constitution, there's a subset of laws and rules and a few cases, which I called the National Security Constitution. But its core principle is that checks and balances don't stop at the water's edge, and that in fact America's power in foreign affairs, like its other powers, are a power shared, not a unilateral power. As a policy matter, I argue that this vision better promotes democracy and reduces the risks of catastrophic outcomes from when you have an unreasoned unilateral president. And what I further argued was that this vision of shared power, presidential powers, are not fixed but fluctuate depending on their disjunction or conjunction with the other branches, stated by Justice Robert Jackson in the steel seizure case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, has been challenged over the centuries by a competing unilateralist vision of the president as, quote, sole organ of our nation in foreign affairs. That was expressed in 1936 in a case called U.S. versus Curtis Wright Export Corporation. And I know it well because when I was in the Justice Department, this was known to the government lawyers as the Curtis Wright, so I'm right, cite. So in other words, in a government brief, if you were losing, you would simply cite Curtis Wright in this proposition. Now, when I wrote the book initially, it was as I was coming up for tenure, which is a permanent position on the faculty, and it was a great rush. And I told my wife, as I was writing it on a green screen, if I get hit by a truck, get the book published. And she said she would do so. She's still my wife after 40 years. I don't know why. But as often happens when you bring the book to publication, it suddenly dawned on me that I had written the book in a way that I didn't prefer, and that maybe sometime in my life I would have a chance to rewrite it for the 21st century. Because I review in the first 9 chapters the beginning of this struggle between shared power and unilateralism, from the founding, America's infancy, to the U.S. rise to be a dominant regional power, to becoming a world hegemon after World War II, and then the post-Cold War years, Bush 1, George H.W. Bush and Clinton, and then the change which came most fundamentally in the 21st century with 9/11 and the age of terror, and then a period of new global threats, which is really now going to be recalled as the Trump era. So starting in 1980, this book becomes increasingly autobiographical because In fact, I worked on virtually every issue that I'm discussing in the book. And I should tell you a story about Lloyd Cutler, who was a graduate of our law school. As Dan mentioned, he became White House counsel for the Carter administration during the Iranian hostages crisis. But in 1994, I was asked to speak at an alumni event in Washington, D.C. And I decided I would bring him a copy of my book. And at that breakfast, they suddenly announced that Lloyd had become White House counsel again. And so I gave him a copy of the book. And he was very interested. He paged through it and said, I'll take a look. Later that year, my boss, Justice Blackmun, decided to retire from the Supreme Court after 24 years. And he went to the White House to announce that he was retiring. And when I called him to congratulate him, he said, you know what? He said, Lloyd Cutler, who I met with, has only one book in his office. It's your book. Which, of course, was the highlight of my academic career. Starting 24 years ago, we started to see a very sharp turn. Now, this had been flagged earlier with the war on Iraq and all of the extreme actions of the George W. Bush administration. But with 9/11, suddenly we saw that 21st century threats were giving even greater institutional incentives for presidents, weak or strong, to monopolize the foreign policy response, Congress to acquiesce, and for the courts to defer or rubber stamp. And let me stress, because this is an important point in this lecture, this is a tale of three branches, not one, and the problem is structural. It's not just personalities. And it's an ethical story, because I have been a lawyer in this system on multiple occasions. And what I started to realize is that lawyers help to create this problem. Lawyers in the US government who try to protect us from national security threats try to do so by giving the president maximum freedom of movement, on the theory that the president, with this maximum flexibility, can protect us against national security threats. But it was our working assumption that the president would have some internalized limit, some sense of public duty or shame or character that would dictate self-restraint. And now, against our best intentions and expectations, the good faith effort of all of these lawyers, including myself, to empower the executive in the name of national security has helped to transform the executive himself into today's greatest national security threat. What an irony. Now, I saw this when I was called back to the government in 2021 to be the senior political appointee in my old office, the office of the legal advisor at the State Department. I had only been gone for 8 years, but it was as if executive power was on steroids. It was as if one muscle of the executive branch had been given an injection of steroids, so that power had flowed steadily toward the executive, within the executive toward the National Security Council, the White House, and the military and intelligence units. Generals told me that they had never experienced a budget increase yearly of less than 20%. Meanwhile, as Nick Burns testified, there were as many people in US military marching bands as diplomats. I used to go to meetings in which there was one lawyer from state, one lawyer from justice, one lawyer from defense, and one lawyer from intelligence. Now there was one lawyer from state, one lawyer from justice, and 10 lawyers from the other agencies, all saying the same thing, and decisions being made by majority vote. And I saw that the administrations, some administrations, particularly the second Bush administration and Trump, grab power proactively, but others like Obama and Biden, who have thin legislative majorities, end up grabbing power reactively so they can get something done. So whether proactively or reactively, the pendulum keeps moving in the unilateralist dimension. What about Congress? Well, we have, as you see, a legislative breakdown. Congress no longer legislates. There's increased polarization, politicization, and passivity. Congress seems to have lost any ability to ignore even the most glaring defects in cabinet nominees. They talk about something called the Overton window in political science, when the previously unimaginable becomes the new normal. So it used to be that the standard of confirmation for an attorney general was, are they a good attorney general? Now it's, are they superior to Matt Gaetz? Meanwhile, Congress has meekly accepted deep interventions into its core constitutional powers, the power of the purse, the power to set tariffs, and the public has come to accept that Congress will do nothing, which is what's made possible the last 100 days, which is government by executive order. Now more than 150 executive orders in the last 100 days. The courts have largely either deferred on grounds of justiciability or immunity, or endorsed the president's power. And in the book, I sketched two different theories they apply on the merits. One I call Youngstown Category 3, where they say that the president's sole constitutional power can override even a contrary statute. So even if Congress has legislated against what the president's doing, he declares the action unconstitutional. And then the second is what is called statutory, what I call statutory Curtis Wright. The Curtis Wright case not only talks about the president as sole organ of the nation in foreign affairs, but also says the president's statutory interpretation should be given extremely broad deference, which means that when the president reads the word invasion to mean an immigration invasion, a statutory Curtis Wright theory would allow that to be sustained. And then we saw at Trump 1.0 this strange combination. The president says, I have an Article 2 of the Constitution which gives me the right to do whatever I want, a servile Congress, and then a compliant Supreme Court majority, three of whom the president appointed. And then on the right-hand side, you see all of the things you know well. Perhaps the most egregious failure was failing to impeach Trump after January 6th. I attended a speech by a journalist where he described that on the morning that after the invasion of the Capitol, when 2 o'clock in the morning, the Congress had finally voted Biden through, he decided to get off on an elevator where Mitch McConnell, the former majority leader, used to ride up and down, and who got on but Mitch McConnell. And McConnell was gleeful, he said, saying, we got him, he's done, Trump is finished. He clearly doesn't like him. At which point, this journalist said, so are you going to vote to impeach him? To which McConnell said, well, I don't know if that's necessary. Well, had he done so, he would be disqualified to run for president, and we would not be going through this period. Now, what made the Trump administration significant or unique is that his legal theory. He invoked Curtis Wright to nullify the rule of law. He said any restraints coming from within the executive branch violate the principle of the unitary executive. Any restraints coming from outside violate the principle of separation of powers. And that this allows the president to basically say all legal restraints are non-existent. And the Supreme Court fell into line in two big cases. First, the travel ban case, where they validated what Justice Sotomayor called in dissent a national security masquerade, in which instead of reading Trump's actual words of prejudice toward Muslims, they deferred to what a hypothetical, unprejudiced president might do. And then in the immunity decision, weakening accountability by creating zones of immunity for a former president's official acts. So, for example, among the immune areas are communications between the president and the attorney general. Well, those of you who remember Watergate, that was the president, Nixon, talking to the attorney general, John Mitchell. In other words, that's the basis of the conspiracy and the grounds for removal. That is now immune. And Chief Justice Roberts' opinion keeps talking about the fear of enfeebling the presidency and weakening future presidents while ignoring the lawless president we just had and now have again. But again, just to show that this is a historical pattern. Weak presidents seize power reactively. Truman's decision to seize the steel mills, Nixon's actions during Watergate, Carter's handling of the Iran hostage crisis, Reagan privatizing foreign policy during the Iran-Contra affair, Biden imposing economic sanctions on Russia after the Ukraine invasion. They all undercorrected for past overreach and resorted to reactive, ad hoc unilateralism, keeping the power flowing in the unilateral dimension. So this is a structural story where the president is both the victim and the villain, because the burdens of dealing with 21st century threats all fall on the president. And as difficult as it is, we can imagine a president who's more bellicose, more competent, and more consistent than Trump. So if this trend, this structural trend continues, we will veer closer to constitutional disaster. What we should also see is the link between unilateralism and lawlessness. I learned this as a dean. When you're an executive official, you never think of yourself as dangerous. You think of yourself as underappreciated. Your worthy motives are misunderstood. And after a while, because you have the burden of responding, because you can exercise executive power, you think you ought to. And so Nixon said, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. Or as Trump recently said, he who saves the country does not violate any law. In other words, the repeated exercise of executive power validates itself. So whoever is president, the president is always responsible, rarely accountable. In the second term, he cannot be checked at the ballot box. Too much depends on his character, which is no longer assured. And so increasingly, we have a government of individuals, not laws, in a country where the Constitution was designed to ensure that the president would not be king. Now, I'll move quickly through the next part because it's well known to all of you, but happy to answer more in question. Trump 2.0, the mass pardons, gutting the executive branch, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which has dismantled congressionally established departments, immigration measures, empowerment of Elon Musk, and then various forms of suppressing dissent. This time, though, his foreign policy is more vindictive, more bellicose, more contemptuous of the law. He doesn't have a foreign policy. It's an ad hoc sanctions policy, overstating claims of national security to demonize immigrants, promote deportations, and justify tariffs. So it is no small rumor that Stephen Miller is likely to be the next national security advisor after the moving of Michael Waltz. Why? Because Stephen Miller already is the national security advisor de facto. And the National Security Council has been subordinated to him in the name of Homeland Security. And also different is more receptivity to using force and talking about using force. Trump has launched multiple strikes on the Houthis in Yemen and advanced outlandish territorial claims against Canada, Gaza, Greenland, the Panama Canal, tipping toward Russia, vacillating toward China, and if you question whether the president is himself a national security threat, consider the attack on preparedness. The president said he wanted to eliminate the Federal Emergency Management Agency. What do we do if there's a natural disaster? He wants to withdraw from Paris, the climate agreement. What do we do if there's a global catastrophe? He wants to withdraw from the World Health Organization. What happens if there are pandemics? And he has destroyed the expertise and the support of career bureaucrats and alienated traditional alliances. Measles, which was eliminated by vaccine, is back. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., in a fit of disinformation, is now urging that people look for other solutions than vaccines. Or take Gaza, where you have Trump had attacked nation building and vowed to withdraw from the Middle East. Now he proposes an Atlantic City solution to address the problem by building a beach resort on the destroyed homes of illegally and involuntarily displaced people of color, to discard the Biden ceasefire plan when there is no place for land for the Gazans, where Egypt and Jordan are being asked to take in more Gazans, and numerous legal questions. Will he occupy and forcibly displace the many Gazans who won't leave? Will he repeat war crimes and violations of the UN Charter and Geneva Conventions for which the US has long criticized Putin? So as they say, America, we have a problem. It's a structural dysfunction among the three branches. It's not just personalities. Even if we throw the rascals out, there will be new rascals. And so this requires structural solutions, not just more undercorrection. This is the low moment of my lecture. What do we need? Let me suggest we need an attitude and a strategy. I call it Mandela and the Martian. So I hope you'll forgive me if I name drop. I met Nelson Mandela once for 30 seconds. It was at the UN with our friend Richard Holbrooke, one of the founders of the American Academy. And Mandela came in to run a session of the Security Council, and Ambassador Holbrooke said, "Mr. President, you were imprisoned on Robben Island for 26 years. How did you survive?" And Mandela said, "You know, I missed the time. I got a lot of reading done." In that moment, you understood why he survived. He didn't get discouraged. And that, I think, needs to be the attitude. So many people, both in the United States and outside, are using what the Scottish call ohone, woe is me, and preemptively capitulating. But what to do? There's a movie called The Martian. You may have seen it. I won't give you a spoiler, but an astronaut is stranded on Mars and he gets out. And when he comes back, he's asked, "Did you think you were going to die?" And he said, "Every second." But what do? You solve one problem, you solve the next problem, you solve the next problem. And if you solve enough problems, in this case, we get to have a new president. We're 2 years away from an election where Trump is almost certain to lose one of the houses, if not both. And the counter strategy is suggested by two pugilistic philosophers. First, Mike Tyson, who said everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Well, we've seen Trump's 100-day plan. The question is how to punch him in the mouth. And the courts are starting to do that. 52 temporary restraining orders or injunctions. And they're getting frustrated. And also Muhammad Ali, who said, use a rope-a-dope test, which is let the other side punch themselves out by expending energy on symbolic initiatives that don't help your core supporters. And then when they're worn out, you come back off and go on the offensive. And so, invoking my last two books, I think we need short and long-term responses to the problem. How to stem the flood and rebuild the dam. These happen to be the theme of my two books. I am, in fact, Dan, doing a new edition of the Trump book with Oxford Press, which argues to invoke transnational legal process to check unilateral overreach and then strengthen the core provisions of the 21st century national security constitution. At least this time we know Trump's many signature moves. But the basic idea here is resistance, revival, resilience, and reform. For example, revive constitutional safeguards. This degradation of our system of checks and balances has come about because various provisions of the Constitution are under-enforced. For example, the power of the purse. Trump has no power to just block aid. He has to follow Congress's directives. Secondly, The foreign commerce power. A group of us are involved in a lawsuit against Trump for his tariffs, which are not authorized by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the Bill of Attainder clause, which we have invoked in the law firm cases. The president has no power to punish his opponents at will. People have said this is a violation of the Bill of Rights, but he actually has no constitutional authority. It's ultra vires. After all, the president cannot be judge, juror, and prosecutor in the same case. That would be a usurpation of the power of the courts. And we learned, the government argued in the Perkins-Coie case, in fact, the Bill of Attainder clause applies only to acts of Congress. But if you think about that, if the president cannot issue a Bill of Attainder when he's supported by 535 legislators, if that's illegal, how can he impose a Bill of Attainder by himself? And it turned out, and we did research on this, going back to the 1400s in England, no king ever issued a Bill of Attainder without parliamentary approval. So the theory being offered by the Trump administration is that Trump has the power to do something that no king of England ever had. In other words, that the Constitution gave him a power that had been denied to the English kings. So we're talking to originalist Supreme Court. They ought to take this into consideration. Now, Justice Brandeis said friction in government can save us from autocracy. Albert O. Hirschman, the economist, said, we can look at competing passions between those who are his true believers and those who would like to seek personal gain, and therefore might have a different vision of what is possible. And we see the goal of letting Trump overplay his hand to disrupt stability, hurt kitchen table economic issues, as he's already doing on tariffs, and alienating his soft supporters. At the international level, as in the first administration, the norm is interdependence. Ironically, resistance to Trump has strengthened leaders in Germany, the UK. Mark Carney would not have won in Canada but for Trump. And so perceived US lawlessness will dilute American smart power, and America first will again become America alone. Counterweights can mobilize our allies, including obviously Germany, international institutions and regimes, states and localities, California, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts are all banded together. Uncowed media, those bureaucrats who can hold on. Former military who have organized projects to protest illegal orders. Non-governmental rule of law and human rights groups like the ACLU, and obviously academic institutions and law firms. Let me just give one example, and then I'll close. We now have two competing notions of what should happen in Ukraine. In the Oval Office, Trump bullied, and J.D. Vance bullied, President Zelensky, saying we want peace at any price. But the next day, Zelensky went to Europe and was offered a peace with guarantees idea, a durable peace plan. Everybody knows there are four issues in an upcoming Ukraine-Russia development. Would be territory, security, post-war reconstruction, and accountability. And the question is, if Trump walks away, as he's threatening to do, will Starmer and Macron and your new chancellor fill the void? Can you contain Orban? The minerals deal does not look like the Marshall Plan to me. But if Trump walks away, will Putin cut a separate deal with him? He seems unwilling to do so. And can a coalition of the willing in Europe do the heavy lifting? By insisting on Ukrainian participation, the so-called nothing about us without us, a European peacekeeping force to implement security guarantees, to keep Ukraine's NATO bid alive, maintain aid and defense capabilities, and then what do we do with 200 billion in euro in frozen Russian assets? Can that be dedicated to post-war construction under the Reconstruction Investment Fund as part of the minerals deal? And finally, can we have an insistence on no sanctions lift without accountability? The longer-term solutions I outlined in the last parts of my book, a broad strategy, a mosaic of reforms in the executive branch, Congress, and the judiciary. In the executive, reaffirming law enforcement independence, avoiding conflicts of interest, restraining the use of force in the domestic space. Within Congress, a better organized Congress, in particular one that reasserts its role in withdrawals from key international agreements. As a constitutional matter, and Dieter knows this well because he read my article, I do not believe that the president has authority to withdraw from all of our treaties and international agreements by himself. Instead, we should be applying a constitutional mirror principle where the amount of legislative input to enter is the amount that is used to exit. At this point, more than 50 courts have already blocked executive orders, and we're facing up to a major Supreme Court test. Injunctions have been issued in a whole variety of cases, and we see the emerging role of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. They should be reducing canons of non-justiciability and deference, asking about executive justifications, and interestingly, they should be looking to foreign law. It's quite ironic that 12 of the justices have said that foreign decisions are relevant to their rulings, which is, of course, an originalist approach, and that includes Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. Look at what they said in Dobbs. Look at what other countries do. Gorsuch, courts in other countries consult American administrative law practices. Kavanaugh, the UN recommends that countries ask a citizenship question. In other words, all of the justices apply foreign law. They just pretend that they don't. And finally, let me say this as a Korean American. If I go to my taco truck and I say, put kimchi in the taco, they do it. Nobody says, you can't put kimchi in the taco. By the way, when I go to a bar mitzvah, they start playing Gangnam Style, which they do billions of times. Nobody says, this is an American Jewish ceremony, we can't have a Korean song. So after all, borrowing foreign law is as American as the Frankfurter or Apfelkuchen. Finally, I go through a bunch of specific reforms in a number of areas. Justice Blackmun told me once, life is long and you learn things. But the message is this: Trump doesn't own the rule of law, we all do. But the world has now finally awoken to the dangers of the imperialist presidency fostered over 250 years. Our choices are pretty simple: apathy, acceptance, despair, or resistance and reform, now or later. And a concerted counter-strategy that begins now of resistance, revival, resilience, and reform will let us both outlive Trump and fix the structural problem. But we have to reaffirm this commitment to the National Security Constitution. Finally, it's important that we act as Americans first, not America first. There's a famous joke: how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? They say one, but the light bulb must want to change. If we're going to change the way our governmental institutions operate in the 21st century, we have to want to change, and we have to see that the problem exists. When I wrote my book, I thought it was just as likely that Biden would be reelected, and I thought I would have to alert people to the dangers of the problem. I don't have to do that anymore. But there are 75 years left in the 21st century, and I'm hoping that this historical analysis will be relevant going forward. So I've gone on, but thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
What I wouldn't do for a hot dog with kimchi now. So many so many things to pick up on. The one that jumps out at me is that, like you, I was an executive branch guy. And whenever I had conversations with colleagues who were working on the Hill, I would often just sort of rub my chin, shrug my shoulders, and say, how can anyone work with these people? They had such a totally different conception of how the branches should work together. And while I instinctively agree with you that we have shared powers, I always come back to the sad fact that the quality of people in the Congress has been declining rather precipitously in our lifetimes. You think back to, Senator Moynihan, Senator Fulbright, people like that, and the crew we have today, who have abdicated power, already a poor sign of their character and their intelligence, but who often just seem incapable of dealing with these issues in any kind of serious way. So a couple of citations. One that's very well known. When it came time for the Congress to read the intelligence about Iraq and the question of was Iraq developing nuclear weapons and what was Saddam Hussein up to, almost no one went into the basement of Congress to read that report. It was a historic dereliction of duty, and the consequences will be with us for many, many years to come. A private one, or less one that's not known. We both knew very well Sandy Berger, who was National Security Advisor under Bill Clinton. And I remember being in his office once, and he came back from a briefing on the Hill with a critical member, I guess, of the Foreign Relations Committee, and, it was someone from the House, and he briefed him on Bosnia for like 90 minutes. And at the end, the congressman said to him, "Now, I just want to make sure I got this all right. What we've been talking about is all in the former Yugoslavia." And Sandy's, conclusion to this was turnips. I have to deal with turnips every day. Pastinaca, is that a turnip? Maybe that's it. So, how are we going to fix that problem? That seems like a problem of, contemporary society. It's hard for me to imagine them, sharing power in this kind of arrangement. Obviously, what we have isn't working, but why are you so optimistic?
Well, so these are good points, Dan, but three things. First, I do an analysis of how this came to be. A lot of this goes back to 1994 when Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House. The Congress became extremely decentralized, and leadership became all the more important. And then the expert committees were largely disempowered. And along 1984 was the constitutional invalidation of the legislative veto, which is a way that Congress could, after the fact, strike down something that the president didn't do what they wanted. So I make three core recommendations in the book. First, I'm not sure why we don't have a joint committee on national security. We have a joint committee on taxation. And so the issues of tax are actually done in a bipartisan way with an expert staff and a group of people who are highly competent. I agree with you. Marjorie Taylor Greene should not be involved in any important decision. But that is not to say that the leaders of the Congress, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Hagel, all of these senators were long-serving, Joe Biden, long-serving congressional leaders who then went to the executive branch. So I think that there should be an institutional incentive to have an expert group to who reports to the leadership. Secondly, I think they need a legal advisor who can issue congressional legal opinions. When the president issues a self-serving opinion where he says, I have the power to do this, in a court, someone would file a brief saying, no, you don't. But there is no mechanism whereby, there are many lawyers in the Congress, but there's no institutional voice of law that has the job of analyzing, for example, the legal basis for the president's actions. And third, Congress just needs better tools. And one of them, for example, even after legislative veto, they can use the kind of fast-track joint expedited approval legislative mechanism that they use in trade to essentially create more discipline in the legislative process. And at the same time, I think Congress needs to clearly state that the president doesn't have unilateral power to withdraw us from every international agreement or treaty. But, by the way, this is not a hypothetical issue. On February 4th of this year, Trump issued an executive order where he said within 90 days, no, I take it back, within 120 days, which is still coming up, the Secretary of State should recommend all of the treaties and international agreements from which the president can withdraw. So they will come back with a list of probably 50 treaties. And one question is whether Trump will actually try to withdraw from all of these treaties by tweet. He withdrew from 25 treaties and international agreements. At the same time, he's entering agreements and he's not reporting them. So, for example, there's an agreement with El Salvador made in secret whereby $15 million was promised so that they could ship prisoners to this CICOT prison, this counterterrorism prison, which is clearly below human rights standards. And nobody has seen this agreement. And nobody knows whose money is being spent. In my view, the entire El Salvadorian prison episode is a repetition of the Iran-Contra affair. It's a private foreign policy being run between Trump and Bukele through private operatives. After all, as Dan well knows, since when does the president of El Salvador have an Oval Office meeting with the president within 60 days after the inauguration? You know, they're one of the smallest powers. And what clearly happened was they made this arrangement. And what's come out in yesterday's New York Times is that some of the people on the plane who were sent to El Salvador were actually sent so that they would not incriminate Bukele in a grand jury proceeding in the New York federal court. So the bottom line here is that Congress just needs to do more investigation and exercise its oversight powers. And all it takes really is for a few congressmen who are upset about tariffs to suddenly decide that they're going to hurt their own chances for re-election if they simply roll over and let Trump destroy the economy. And I think you're starting to see rumblings of this. I think it'll take more time, but we'll see it.
So you and I had a conversation, I think several months ago, in which you said that you thought that overreach was going to be the key issue, and I share that view. But if we look at how overreach is manifested and what the pushback is, and then we look at the different sort of sources of power in which we may see that pushback, you know, there are also reasons to be concerned. And we talked about Congress, let's talk about the courts. You know, everyone's standard talking point is we'll really be in trouble when he blows through a court order. Well, he's already blown through a lot of court orders. And, you know, I think it's a safe concern that if he keeps blowing through court orders, we are on the other side of the rule of law. And I'm curious how, in your mind, that is how we're going to avoid that problem, or what do the courts have other than their moral suasion, you know?
So I think this turns on two words, John Roberts. I went to law school with John Roberts, he was a year ahead of me. We won't talk about what John Roberts doesn't care about, but what he does care about is the name John Roberts, and especially the John Roberts Court. And if the John Roberts Court is a laughingstock or is viewed in history as the court that destroyed judicial review, then his adult career is a failure. And I think that we are approaching that moment. Now, up until this point, they have given Trump every opportunity to pay lip service to the rule of law. So, for example, after Trump threatens to impeach all of these judges, including my student Jeb Boasberg, who's a good friend of Roberts, Roberts issues a two-sentence statement. We don't impeach judges. But he has persisted. And then secondly, they ruled by a vote of 9-0 that you have to effectuate the return of Abrego Garcia, the guy who was sent by administrative error. Now, I hope everybody sees, this was a done deal. Bukele and Trump sat in the Oval Office and talked about it. All Bukele had to do was keep his mouth shut, and all Trump had to do was say, I'm working on facilitating, but not effectuating his return, and I'm satisfying the court order. Instead, Trump, in a variety of settings, makes it absolutely clear that he's done nothing. In fact, in an interview by Time magazine, said, did you ask Bukele? He said, no. And then Bukele, Chris Van Hollen, our senator from Maryland, goes down there, and they say, you can't see Abrego Garcia. And then on the third day, they bring him out. So Bukele cracks. And, if Bukele had simply not brought him out, you would ask, well, we don't know where he is. Well, if you can bring him to the hotel, you can bring him to America. And then third, and very few people noticed this, when they filed the request for the stay with Justice Alito to say, let's block the return of all of these guys under the Alien Enemies Act, Roberts intervened and took the decision away from Alito. So the one paragraph opinion, which would normally say a stay application has been referred to the Chief Justice and is referred to the full court, simply says an application is before the court. And Alito and Thomas dissented without even being given an opportunity to write an opinion. That suggests that we have the possibility of 7-2, and you could lose a couple from 7-2, to issue a strong pushback against Trump. And they've just granted certiorari in the birthright citizenship case, in which multiple courts have ruled that the Constitution, 14th Amendment, line 1, says, persons born in the United States are birthright citizens. That's why I'm a citizen. So for me, it's personal. So that's going to be argued in a couple days. And my view is, watch Roberts very carefully, because Trump has made it very hard for him to side with Trump. And I think Roberts is an expert on setting limits while not setting limits. And the question is, at some point it's going to dawn on him that he created the monster too. And then the question is, he's got this opportunity, and the question is, does he take it? Now, this happened in Guantanamo under the Bush administration. Make no mistake, the lower courts are almost unanimous in their rulings against Trump without regard to political affiliation. So I think the two questions are, when do a number of Republican senators slip? And when does the Supreme Court tell Trump no? And then that's when he gets punched in the face.
And I guess we'll just have to hope and wait and see that he experiences it as a punch in the face and not as something less effective.
Well, if not, I have my political asylum application ready to go here. Deutschland. Only kidding, folks. Only kidding.
So it is, I want to ask you though about what you felt when a graduate of Yale Law School cited Andrew Jackson, the president in the 1830s who defied the court and said, what was it, Justice Marshall, right? Justice Marshall's made his decision, let him enforce it. What happens at Yale Law anyway when you have a vice president who can say things like that? I'm sorry.
Well, I was in the government when the vice president was at Yale Law School. He didn't take my class. What I'm told and what I believe is that he is a chameleon. His mother had multiple husbands, and when he came to Yale Law School, his name was J.D. Bowman, and his stepfather, wore earrings, and so he wore earrings, and then he changed the name to J.D. Hamill, and Hamill smoked a vape pipe, so he smoked a vape pipe. And so he takes on the coloration of the person who is his mentor, who then became Peter Thiel and now Trump. One of my students and alums said to me, who knew him very well, he was quite a sweet guy who had a sarcastic edge. And I said, what's he now? And he said, he's a sarcastic guy who has no sweet edge. So, this happens, and, it's interesting to see. Vance, I think, is ecstatic because yesterday, on Meet the Press, Trump singled out two people as possibly succeeding him. One is Vance and the other is Marco Rubio, who, as you know, now holds 4 jobs. And Trump had said that he openly disdained Rubio as little Marco, so he doesn't have a huge, obvious respect for Rubio. So if you're J.D. Vance, you think, and then he also said yesterday, he didn't say I'm not running for president for a 3rd term, but he certainly threw some cold water on it. So when we talk about someone who's smart, able, and sees a future in this direction, it's J.D. Vance. One thing that's significant about Trump's appointees, despite their lack of experience in actually doing the jobs for which they've been appointed, all of them have public affairs experience. Vance was a public affairs guy for his military unit, and he's quite skilled at manipulating information in these public settings, which is what happened in the debate. He out-debated Waltz, the governor of Minnesota, because he's more glib. And someone told me, and I haven't checked this out myself, but that supporters of Vance said that during the campaign for president, Trump had less than 200 unsupervised engagements with the press, that Kamala Harris and Waltz had between 200 and 300, and that Vance had 1,500 to 1,700, in which he only made a few obvious errors. I think the problem is that most of those errors were made here, at Munich and at Greenland and others. But at home, he's riding high, and I think he thinks he's going to be president. Now, there's a whole furor in our law school. Some people have written saying that his portrait should be hung. And the dean skillfully said, we do that at the end of the term. So she was well trained on this by prior deans.
So, first of all, I want to apologize. So doesn't come up again between us. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jam you on Yale Law School, but what?
Well, we also had Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Jake Sullivan, John Feiner, Wally Adeyemo, Gina Raimondo. I could go on, Sonia Sotomayor, I could go on.
Definitely a game of percentages. Okay. Since you know John Roberts, since you worked on the court, what goes through the minds of the justices when they read the newspaper and the president has said he's not sure if if everyone is entitled to due process, and he just doesn't know, he just keeps saying that.
I think that's what's going to offend Roberts the most. It's not having a dim view of individual rights. It's saying openly that these words don't matter. Because if they don't matter, then John Roberts' court is a facade. It's playing cover for political power. And that means that John Roberts and his court are less important. And they want to be viewed as important. And when Trump came into the joint session of Congress and thanked Roberts for doing what he had done, I'm sure that had a chilling effect on him. I think you all know about the pizza deliveries, which is the federal judges across America are receiving pizzas at their homes. And it's a way in which people are telling them, we know where you live. One of the judges who received it told me, we learned that you can send a pizza without paying for it if you use a particular pizza company. So Roberts is the leader of the judiciary, and they're all going to these circuit conferences. And judges are coming up to him saying, people are threatening us, you're our protector, are you going to protect us or not? And the question is, how is he going to respond to that? I think somewhere is some self-preservation instinct, which is leading to a pretty elaborate calculation right now. But we'll see it. Just watch the oral argument in the birthright citizenship case. What Roberts often does in these oral arguments, I think I've seen him do it for 40-something years, he starts by taking one extreme position and really attacking the counsel. And then it's clear that he doesn't believe that. Then he takes the opposite position, extreme, and attacks the counsel for the other side. And it's pretty clear he doesn't believe that. And then he waits for the other justices to emerge with some compromise. And then in various ways, he asks micro questions which support this middle course. And be looking for that. If he asks 5 questions in the oral argument on birthright citizenship, look at the 5th question and the answer. That's the one that tells you what he wants to do. And then the question is, can he lead 5 justices in that direction? Now, Coney Barrett is a very interesting person in that her opinion in the immunity case was much more moderate than Roberts. And the question is, well, why didn't they go there? Why did they need to go? And Roberts was the one who decided to make it a grand decision. In fact, ironically, he starts by citing the Youngstown decision at great length, even though it has nothing to do with Youngstown. So, and by the way, the court will only hear one case in May. And then the Trump administration will go through the summer, and then we'll see a bunch of big court cases. Martin is here from Wilmer Hale. The law firm cases are going. The other day, the law firm, the judges, the first judge wrote a 102-page decision striking down the executive order. The other cases are yet to come. I think they're going to win all of them in the lower courts. And then the question is, when does that case get to the Supreme Court? The number of amicus briefs that were filed, thousands of people joining in. So I think this is the future of American independent law and the practice of law in America. if you're a justice who cares about whether law students and others hear good things about you, this is going to matter to you.
I want to go back to the high planes of theory now, and not the rather dismal details of the nitty-gritty right now. Let's just say that we have an experience somewhat like Watergate, in that there's a president who ends his term one way or another, in a way that the presidency is much weakened, and Congress decides it's time to make big reforms so that what happened before doesn't happen again. First of all, can you imagine that as being the kind of pathway that would lead to your more shared powers? And I guess the counterpoint to that is we both worked for presidents who spent a lot of time cursing about the fact that they didn't have more power. And it just seems that with the enormous elaboration of the executive branch, with literally millions of people working for you, you're going to still find some way to be more powerful than the Congress. And can it really be institutionally reformed? I'm curious how we get to the kingdom of Koh at the end of this process.
Yeah, well, I mentioned a mosaic of reforms, and I think below the radar, a number of laws have been passed in the last 5 years that nobody really noticed. But when you put them all together, they start to reverse the trend. So what you described, Dan, in 1974, after Watergate in Vietnam, there was a massive election where the Democrats got a very large majority, and then they passed in rapid sequence the War Powers Resolution, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Intelligence Oversight Act, the Export Control Act, a whole framework of national security framework legislation that helped to reshape the horizon. I think the question is, will we get to that point? What I think is maybe more likely is that Trump will, through a series of unforced errors. I really want to stress this. Trump is doing this to himself. He didn't have to take such an extreme position on immigration. He didn't have to do the tariffs. But the impact on this is so dramatic, and it's affecting every single American, that Trump in the first term, the first crisis that visited him was COVID. And so, and by the way, we're about to have another measles outbreak because Robert Kennedy doesn't know how to tell people to get vaccinated. Plus, the price of eggs went through the roof because of avian flu, the strain of it. And so I do think that some combination of unforced errors will lead to members of Congress, for purely self-interested reasons, saying, if I stick with this and stick to these extreme claims, I'm going to be defeated. And then they're going to move to a more moderate position. Look at Elise Stefanik, who was nominated to be UN ambassador, was betrayed. And so now, instead of staying in the Congress, she says she's running for governor of New York, where I assume she'll lose. And I do think that what we're looking at is in 2 years, that's why the window is 2 years, Trump will face the exact same sets of restraints that people like Biden and Clinton faced, but they've already used up their claims of executive power. I think they will have brought a huge set of judicial decisions pushing back against these claims, and I think if they had taken a more moderated approach in the first 100 days, they might have had more long-term success over the course of the 4 years. I'm quite convinced of this.
So I see that we have used more than our allotted time, so we should definitely go to the audience for some questions now. And we'll begin with Dieter Green.
There is this long line of academic books still growing in the United States where the thesis is conflicts about the Constitution shouldn't be decided by courts, but they should be decided in the political process. That's to say, by those people who are bound by the Constitution. And there is this long line of law school professors who call themselves realists and tell their students the law doesn't matter anyway. The courts decide according to other criteria, institutional interests, personal preferences, etc. So my first question would be, which is the contribution of the law schools to the present state of the rule of law in the United States? And the second question is shorter. How many of the suggestions you made, with which I sympathize very much, would require constitutional amendments, or how many not?
Well, the one that requires, that should have been done, is to eliminate the role of money in politics. You know, many years ago, your professor and mine, Paul Freund at Harvard, said, we all know money talks, but that's the problem. It's not the answer. And the idea that these tech billionaires in a time of massive inequality are able to spend money to elect their candidate, you know, and now quite openly, as you saw, Elon Musk spent millions of dollars to defeat a Supreme Court justice in Wisconsin, and she won anyway. So that's the one that I think, and Hillary Clinton called for a constitutional amendment, but I think that's the one in which the court has to decide that the Citizens United case was wrongly decided because it has perverted the electoral structure. I do think, though, Dieter, you're right very much that the popular movements that have not yet taken place at the level needed are the rights of the demands of diversity and post civil rights forms of affirmative action. You know, Harvard Law School has almost returned to a lily white student body. And that cannot be good. And the number of voices actually speaking up for diversity among law students has dramatically declined because they have announced that diversity and equity and inclusion are enemies of the state, and that universities that do this will lose money. So most of these actions are being brought by the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I think there needs to be pushback against that. Second, I don't think people have fully acknowledged that the disaster of the overruling of Roe versus Wade has just made the women's health and social situation dramatically worse. My daughter works in this area, and the question is, how does the equal rights movement, you know, Joe Biden on his last day in office sort of tepidly announced that the Equal Rights Amendment had passed, and nobody seemed to notice. And then the third is the movement for equality for based on sexual orientation, and how this will, you know, there was a mass movement supporting same-sex marriage and legalization or the elimination of sodomy laws. And I think entire generations of people, independent of political affiliation, as they do here, I think. There's an important moment I want to tell you all here in Germany, because I think you'll appreciate it. When they decided, the Clinton administration, to consider gays in the military and elimination of the don't ask, don't tell policy, I convened a group of lawyers from NATO nations And our General Counsel of the Department of Defense said, we're very concerned about the cohesion of units where there are LGBT soldiers and cis straight soldiers in the same units. So I said, can we go around the room? And the first person to speak was from Germany. And he said, well, as you may know, we admitted gays to our military in 1969. There was a bit of a problem until early 1970, and since then everything's been fine. And he said, and in fact, I'm gay, and I'm married, and we don't understand where the problem comes from. And the US person said, what about unit cohesion? And the German government lawyer said, you may not know, but Americans have been serving with gay Germans in NATO units since 1969 and 1970, and they seem to be quite cohesive. Now, this is very good in terms of rebutting false facts, for which there's a claim compelling governmental interest. So, and what is the role of law schools? I think the role of law schools now is to tell students courage is contagious, and so is cowardice, and you have to choose. I encourage all of you to look at the third footnote of the Perkins-Coie decision, where they say, when the history of this period is written, the law firms who stood up and challenged the government will be the ones who will be remembered as having done the right thing. And you've witnessed it here in this society. We witnessed it in ours in the McCarthy era, and I think it's the same moment of truth.
Can't tell you how glad I am that we're at a former Hale event and not at a Skadden Arts event. So, okay.
By the way, the students are not attending these recruitment. They're not signing up for the firms who caved. The impact will be huge.
Always. Yeah. Question? All the way in the back. Oh, sorry, Yana.
Dear Professor Koh, thank you very much for your insightful and highly topical lecture. As you discussed the topic, the role of checks and balances in constitutional design, I would be very much interested in your take on the following issue that is currently being discussed among students at our university. Some of us, including me, strongly believe that the European Union should continue its path of deeper integration and in the long term should consider electing a European president. If such an office were to be created, how might it be designed to ensure both the necessary prominence and executive authority, while also embedding the sufficient safeguards to prevent abuse of power, as we see in the US right now? In your view, what would be the most constitutionally sound and politically feasible approach? Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you're thinking about this at Humboldt, because you have to be. My view is Germany is living at a time where China has announced its position, where Putin seems to be committed to reclaiming lost empire, and the United States is a tepid or unreliable supporter of the post-war system it helped to create. So that leaves Europe and the like-minded, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and then countries like Korea, which is of course my home country, have had shaky experiences too. So I think that there's a challenge because post-Brexit, my own impression is that the British, especially those of your generation, believe that Brexit was a mistake. They've seen the impact on the economy and the stature of Great Britain. And so the question is, how can the European Union, with the leadership of the great European powers, move to continue a sort of Kantian alliance? Not world government, but government by a community of democracies with like-minded values. The test of that has been Ukraine. And I think the real question is, we already see that Trump's negotiations with Putin and then his attempts to bully Zelensky are addressing a small percentage of the issues that are going to be resolved or are going to be needed to secure long-term security. And I mentioned 4: territory security, accountability, and reconstruction. It's going to be the European central bankers who decide whether that money that's frozen gets unfrozen and whether it flows to Ukrainian reconstruction as opposed to going back to Putin. So I think that you have a new government starting tomorrow, and it's an important test for really an extraordinarily important country. And one that I think the question really being put is whether the European coalition of the willing can fill the gap previously played by the United States, which has become an unreliable partner. Mark Carney said this very explicitly in winning the election in Canada the other day. As an American, it makes my heart sink to think that we're no longer reliable. But I do think it presents an opportunity for Europe, and it's something that they prepared for. My friend Klaus Kress has a piece you should see, and I'll ask that it be sent around to all of you, but citing what should be the role of Germany in the weeks and months ahead.
One last question. We're going a little over. Okay, I saw that hand first. Can't see a person, but there was a hand.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation so far. I have 2 related questions. The first is building on the question of judicial culture. There seems to be, at least from what I've heard from my friends in the US, a sort of right-wing seizure of the legal culture in universities. An example would be there's greater sort of influence of federalist, originalist thinking, but also popularity of some right-wing scholars. Think of Adrian Vermeer, and the integralist idea on American jurisprudence. And I was just wondering about why is this so pervasive, at least in popular reading of some of the legal articles I've read. Second question would be more towards what's in articulation of the constitutional vision of POTUS, of the American government. What's your vision of the federalism that you see? Because there's always this contradiction, because we often see that the Supreme Court has been a blocker towards some centralizing presidential authority under Democrats, from FDR to Obama, in terms of some of the policies, some of the issues like climate change or economic policies. And then you're also now confronted with the fact that these powers can be weaponized against people that we've seen today. And so what then is the right balance, perhaps, with regards to presidential authority on some of these issues?
Well, both are good questions. Let me first dispute the idea that these figures you're mentioning are actually taking over the academia. These people are very marginal, very marginal. I have an article that I urge you to read in the Yale Journal of International Law called the Yale School of International Law. There's a lot of focus on whether Americans believe in international law, and it focuses on a number of fringe schools, a neo-sovereigntist school that's at Chicago and Harvard, a political science school that's at Princeton, a global administrative law school that's at NYU and increasingly the European University Institute, and then a group of critical schools, critical race, critical feminist, third world approaches. When you put them all together, they make up maybe 25% of American international law academics. And the core of those people who believe that international law and U.S. law can be construed together to promote world public order and human dignity is a vast majority of the international law scholars in America. So the people you mentioned, I think, they have a majority on the Supreme Court, but they certainly do not have a majority in academic faculties. And by the way, the first 100 days of Trump have driven many of the people who are nominally originalists into the arms of people like me. I've signed a series of briefs with conservative legal scholars who, for example, do not believe that the president has power to impose tariffs willy-nilly. People like Mike McConnell at Stanford or Ilya Somin at George Washington. The second question, George Mason, I'm sorry. The second question you ask is a very important one because I do believe that in a federal system, the states have much more freedom to operate in a manner consistent with federal policy. And we're going to see this tested because the top 12 blue states, Democratic states, make up really a startling 60% of the economy. You know, California alone is the 5th largest economy in the world. And those alliances are working together on maintaining the U.S. connection to the Paris Accord, maintaining the U.S. connection to the World Health Organization, to fight against immigration acts. And the attorney generals of those states are leading the way. Now, as you all know, in the United States, the word AG means aspiring governor. And those Democratic attorney generals feel that showing their constituents that they can oppose the Trump administration is also a path to electoral success. So a question will be, does the Trump administration have resources to try to actually preempt all of these state challenges, collective and individual? One thing not mentioned is they fired most of the people in the Justice Department who know things about bringing these cases. And those lawyers are going to work for people who are now suing the government. And it has now become common in these cases for the Justice Department to say, we don't have the resources to litigate the case. Why? Because we fired all the guys who knew anything about it. And so increasingly the private resources are going to overwhelm the public resources. Now, the one counter to this is they have all these law firms who supposedly committed resources. We just wrote an article. I believe these law firm deals are unenforceable. It's just basic contract law. Trump didn't agree to anything. He didn't give anything up. You know, if one of the firms reneges on its commitment, he can impose the exact same executive order against them that he would have imposed otherwise. There was no meeting of the minds. So even if these contracts weren't unconscionable or formed under duress, there's no reason why they should be respected at this point, and there's no reason why new law firms. So one thing we encourage is some of the firms said, well, we think we can represent the military or veterans. Well, represent veterans who are seeking gender-affirming care and see if the Trump administration tries to veto that. And what's happening now is you have a lot of law firms who are preemptively silencing themselves and letting their pro bono committees operate under a cloud because they fear government regulation. But in fact, there's no sign that the government is well enough organized under Trump to address this question. So there's actually a second opportunity for these law firms to show some courage. When the 4 law firms that filed suit win, which they will, then the firms who signed the deals, 9 of them, could well ask, what are we getting out of being in these deals? And they will have an opportunity to reconsider. And I think among other things, the associates who work at these firms will say, don't we have a vote also? And shouldn't we be heard? So I think this is, once the cracks start to show, and I think they're already starting to show, I think there'll be occasions for more creative uses of federalism, more challenges. And again, a lot of this will turn on what the Supreme Court does or what it signals.
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there. We could probably go for another hour and no one would mind, except perhaps Harold. But I want to thank you all for coming.